The entire courtroom froze when Justice Barrett launched an attack no one saw coming. Her words cut through the air like a blade, cold and deliberate, echoing against the marble walls of the Supreme Court chamber. Reporters shifted in their seats, pens suspended midair. Lawyers stiffened. Even seasoned observers, used to the weight of judicial power, felt the tension crawl up their spines. It was the kind of moment that strips away all pretense of civility. Barrett leaned forward, her tone sharp, calculated, designed to bruise. She wasn't asking a question, she was issuing a challenge. Every syllable dripped with authority, and yet behind that authority pulsed something harsher: dismissal, arrogance, a desire to reduce Jasmine Crockett to a footnote. The room itself seemed to hold its breath. The dark wood benches, the towering bookshelves, the gilded chamber where America's most consequential decisions are born, suddenly it felt less like a court of law and more like an arena. Cameras blinked like unblinking eyes, recording every flicker of expression, every shift in posture. Outside, millions would soon watch the footage, dissecting the exact moment dignity was put on trial. Barrett's words had been chosen with surgical precision, questioning not just Crockett's argument, but her very standing to be in that room. It was a strike aimed not at ideas but identity, a challenge rooted in the age-old belief that some voices don't belong, that some people should know their place. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't rush to respond. She sat there, hands steady, her face a mask of calm that only deepened the silence. The pause stretched longer than anyone expected, and in that pause the entire chamber felt a shift, like the quiet before a storm. Spectators exchanged glances. Some smirked, certain Barrett had cornered her. Others leaned forward, sensing something different, something powerful building beneath the surface. And then, the silence became almost unbearable. Every heartbeat in that chamber seemed to thud louder, waiting, daring Crockett to speak. Barrett's gaze tightened, as if willing her opponent to falter. But the silence that followed would soon be shattered by a response no justice, and no American will ever forget. This was not just another hearing. This was not just another exchange of questions and answers, destined to fade into the background of Washington noise. No, this case was the kind that carried the weight of history, the kind that would echo in classrooms, in neighborhoods, in living rooms across America. At its core, it was about belonging. Who gets to speak with authority in this nation? Who gets to define justice? And who has the courage to challenge the old order when it tries to silence a new voice? The stakes were enormous because the subject before the court touched every nerve in America's identity: the rights of the marginalized, the power of government to exclude, and the question of whether dignity could survive in the face of entrenched power. Millions were watching, not simply because of the legal arguments, but because they sensed something deeper unfolding, a struggle between two visions of America itself. Justice Barrett had entered the chamber carrying the armor of authority. She knew her robe gave her gravity. She knew the weight of her title allowed her words to slice with impunity. But beneath the robe and behind the polished rhetoric was a performance, carefully designed to belittle, to remind everyone who sat higher on the dais and who sat below it. Her attack was not only legal but personal, rooted in a long tradition of cloaking arrogance in the language of jurisprudence. To her, this was about drawing lines, maintaining hierarchies, keeping certain people in their place. Barrett represented the archetype of the villain, not because she shouted or sneered, but because she wielded condescension like a weapon. With every tilt of her head, every tightening of her voice, she embodied the belief that power grants the right to diminish others. For her, the chamber was not a forum of equals, it was a stage, and she was determined to dominate it. And then, across from her, sat Jasmine Crockett, calm, composed, unshaken. She didn't rush to fill the silence. She didn't let the weight of Barrett's authority crush her into retreat. Instead, she leaned into the quiet, letting it build, as though she knew that silence itself was a kind of power. Crockett carried the marks of underestimation. To some, she was young, outspoken, too bold for her own good. To others, she was the wrong kind of person in the wrong kind of room. But those very judgments became her strength. Every insult she had ever endured, every door that had been slammed in her face, every whisper that she didn't belong, those moments had forged her into someone who could sit in this chamber, under the scrutiny of the nation, and still radiate dignity. She was the hero of this story not because she sought the spotlight, but because she embodied something larger: resilience, the refusal to be diminished, the quiet confidence that truth does not need to shout in order to be heard. And in that chamber, under the gaze of history, she carried not just her own story, but the hopes of those who had been told, time and again, that they didn't belong either. This was no ordinary clash. This was dignity on trial. This was arrogance daring to challenge resilience. And the answer to who would prevail hung in the balance, teetering on the edge of one response, one sentence, one moment of truth. What she said next would ripple far beyond the marble walls of the court. To understand the sting of Barrett's attack, you had to look at the road she had walked to reach that high bench. Justice Amy Coney Barrett had long been presented as the embodiment of composure, sharp, disciplined, draped in the language of law. She was, to many, the image of propriety, a jurist who spoke of fairness, originalism, and fidelity to the Constitution. But scratch the surface and a different story began to emerge, one that painted her not as a neutral guardian of justice, but as a figure who used her robe as armor to advance her ideology while denying she was doing so. Her confirmation itself had been a spectacle, rushed through in the heat of a national election, a whirlwind of partisanship disguised as solemn duty. She had promised neutrality, vowed that she would not be swayed by politics. Yet, almost immediately, her rulings told another story. Time and again, she leaned toward outcomes that fortified the powerful and diminished the vulnerable. Her defenders praised her restraint, her intellect, her faithfulness to the text. But critics saw the pattern, a justice who claimed impartiality while her decisions seemed to trace a partisan line with eerie precision. There was the ruling that chipped away at reproductive rights, couched in language of judicial modesty even as it stripped women of agency. There were decisions narrowing voting protections, delivered with an almost surgical detachment, as though democracy itself were just another legal puzzle to be trimmed down piece by piece. There were moments when she spoke of respecting precedent, only to turn and carve exceptions so wide the precedent crumbled. It was this duality, this insistence on presenting herself as a servant of the law, while consistently advancing outcomes aligned with her ideological camp, that gave her power its peculiar edge. She didn't roar. She didn't pound the table. She cloaked her convictions in civility, her biases in polished rhetoric. That was her skill, and that was her shield. But civility can be its own form of arrogance. Beneath her calm delivery lived the belief that her vision of the Constitution was not just one view, but the view. She wore her composure like a crown, suggesting that those who challenged her were merely too emotional, too biased, too unlearned to see what she could see. It wasn't just authority she carried, it was condescension, quiet but unmistakable. Over the years, that condescension had gone largely unchecked. Critics railed, yes, but inside the sanctum of the court, few had ever spoken back to her in a way that pierced the aura she so carefully cultivated. She was used to the silence that followed her barbs. She was used to the deference, the nods, the fearful respect of those who dared not cross her. And so, when she turned her sights on Jasmine Crockett, she assumed it would be more of the same. Another sharp exchange, another demonstration of her control over the room. Another moment in which her robe and her title would shield her from consequence. After all, Barrett had mastered the art of delivering wounds that left no visible scar, attacks wrapped in professionalism, calibrated to make the target seem small while she appeared composed. But arrogance unchecked eventually grows brittle. The more it is indulged, the more it assumes invincibility. And beneath Barrett's polished surface, cracks were forming. Every ruling that favored power over people, every contradiction between her rhetoric and her results, every dismissal of voices who did not look like hers, each had added weight to the illusion she carried. And illusions, however grand, are fragile things. This day in the chamber was different, though Barrett could not see it yet. Her words landed with the same precision, the same practiced bite, but this time the silence that followed was not submission. It was the silence of anticipation, of something gathering strength on the other side of her attack. She mistook it for victory, when in fact it was the first tremor of a reckoning. Because arrogance, when left unchecked, eventually meets its counterforce. And in Jasmine Crockett, Barrett had found not a timid adversary, but a woman forged in storms fiercer than anything this courtroom could conjure. Crockett was not there to play the role Barrett had assigned her. She was not there to wilt under the shadow of the robe. She was there to remind the chamber, and the country, that dignity speaks louder than arrogance ever could. Barrett had spent years crafting an image of invulnerability, but this moment would expose the truth. Her authority was not unshakable. Her words, no matter how sharp, could not silence a voice rooted in lived struggle and unshakable conviction. But little did she know, the very target she tried to weaken was the one most prepared to stand tall. Before Jasmine Crockett ever sat in that chamber, before her name trended across social media and her face appeared on primetime news, she was simply a young woman learning how to push back against the weight of the world. She was born into a country that loved to celebrate opportunity yet often placed invisible walls around those who didn't fit the narrow mold of power. From the very beginning, her life became an education in resilience. As a child, Crockett knew the sting of being underestimated. Teachers doubted her abilities not because of her talent but because of the stereotypes attached to her skin, her voice, her very presence. Classmates repeated those doubts in subtler ways, a sideways comment here, a smirk there. But where others might have shrunk, she sharpened. The dismissals became fuel. She She learned that silence could be broken, that invisibility could be resisted, and that her mind, her quickness, her determination, was a weapon stronger than any insult. Law was not her first destiny, but it became the natural path. The courtroom called to her because it was the very place where injustice was dressed up as formality, where power often disguised itself as neutrality. She wanted to strip those disguises away. When she walked into law school, she carried not just ambition but the weight of those who had been told they didn't belong. In every lecture, every late night bent over casebooks, every exam was not just for herself, it was for every voice dismissed in classrooms like hers. But the journey was never clean. Sexism followed her, pressing against her ambitions with subtle sneers and overt dismissals. Racism shadowed her, a constant reminder that success would never erase the barriers she faced. She was told again and again that she was too loud, too passionate, too unwilling to play the quiet game that others expected of her. Yet every time the world demanded silence, she chose to speak louder. When she entered the practice of law, she walked into spaces where almost no one looked like her. Judges eyed her with suspicion. Opposing counsel underestimated her. Juries doubted her before she even opened her mouth. But those biases only sharpened her resolve. She learned to turn doubt into drama, to hold a room not by demanding respect but by commanding it. And when clients, often poor, often overlooked, saw her standing beside them, they understood that for once, the system might hear their story told with dignity. Her rise into Congress carried the same rhythm. She wasn't born into privilege, wasn't handed the golden keys of legacy politics. She clawed her way into the halls of power, propelled by grit and by a voice that could not be ignored. In campaigns, she faced the whispers, too brash, too young, too different. Yet voters saw through the whispers. They recognized in her the fire of someone who wasn't performing, but living the struggle every day. On the House floor, Crockett's presence was unmistakable. She did not blend in with the chorus of polished politicians who spoke in measured platitudes. She spoke with rhythm, with bite, with the urgency of someone who knew time was too precious for niceties. When others tried to box her in, she expanded. When critics mocked her passion, she leaned into it. And slowly, the very traits dismissed as weaknesses became her defining strength: authenticity, resilience, refusal to bow. Still, every step upward meant facing walls of resistance. Sexism in the backhanded compliments disguised as advice. Racism in the questions of whether she was qualified enough. Doubt in the form of whispers that she was only temporary. A loud voice in a system that would eventually swallow her whole. But every time the walls rose, she climbed. Every time the doubt thickened, she broke through. Her story became less about individual victories and more about collective triumph. For every young woman told her voice was too sharp, for every immigrant child told their identity was a liability, for every working-class family told they didn't belong in the chambers of power, Crockett became proof that the rules of exclusion could be broken. And so, when she sat in the Supreme Court chamber, facing the cool stare of Justice Barrett, she wasn't just Jasmine Crockett, the Congresswoman. She was the accumulation of every slight, every dismissal, every uphill climb that had tried and failed to break her. She was the product of storms endured and lessons carved in fire. The weight of history rested on her shoulders, but it did not bend her. Instead, it straightened her spine, lifted her chin, steadied her breath. Because this was more than another legal clash. This was the moment when her personal story intersected with the nation's. Every trial in her life had been preparing her for this exact moment under these exact lights. Justice Barrett's words sliced again, sharper this time. Her voice wrapped in the authority of the robe yet edged with impatience. She leaned in, her questions less like inquiries and more like accusations, crafted to corner Jasmine Crockett, to force her into a defensive crouch. The chamber tightened with each exchange, as though the very air was caught between the two women. Crockett, however, did not flinch. She answered with measured calm, her voice steady, her gaze unbroken. Every word she spoke was deliberate, as if she were laying bricks in a foundation that would not crack under pressure. Where Barrett expected stumbles, Crockett delivered clarity. Where Barrett hoped for rattled nerves, she found composure. The spectators could feel the heat rising. Reporters scribbled faster, their pens barely keeping pace with the rapid volley. Barrett pressed harder, layering her questions one on top of another, trying to overwhelm with speed and authority. She demanded answers framed her way, boxed within her definitions. Yet Crockett refused the trap. She redirected, reframed, answering not as Barrett dictated but on her own terms. Barrett's irritation began to show in subtle flickers. Her lips tightened between sentences. Her gaze sharpened, almost narrowed. Her tone grew clipped, each syllable landing like a gavel. For a justice known for her composed demeanor, the cracks were visible now. She had expected a quick dismantling, but instead she was meeting resistance, unyielding, discipline undeniable. Crockett, by contrast, radiated steadiness. She didn't match fire with fire. She didn't need to. Her restraint became its own weapon, each pause a reminder that she was in control of her pace, not Barrett. She leaned into silence the way a master orator leans into cadence, letting the weight of Barrett's aggression hang unanswered, just long enough to turn discomfort back onto its source. The rhythm of the exchange was cinematic. Barrett struck, Crockett absorbed. Barrett jabbed, Crockett pivoted. The chamber was no longer just a courtroom, it was a stage, and the nation was watching a duel of power and dignity. Every exchange raised the stakes, every answer pulled the audience deeper into the drama. Those in the gallery leaned forward now, eyes fixed on Crockett. Whispers fluttered at the edges of the room as observers began to sense that the imbalance Barrett sought to project was tipping in the opposite direction. On social media, the clips would later be dissected frame by frame. Barrett's impatience, Crockett's calm, the visible shift in who truly commanded the room. Barrett tried once more to reassert control, her words sharper, almost cutting off Crockett mid-sentence. Answer the question as asked, she snapped, her tone carrying the unmistakable edge of frustration. Gasps rippled softly through the room, not loud, but audible enough to confirm what everyone was witnessing. The justice was losing composure. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't retaliate in kind. Instead, she steadied herself and spoke with a calm that seemed to expand through the chamber, a calm that made Barrett's agitation appear even more jarring. Her tone carried something deeper than defiance, it carried certainty. It was in that moment the tension reached its peak. The clash was no longer about a single question, no longer about a single exchange of words. It was about what each represented. Barrett, the embodiment of arrogance cloaked in authority, trying to maintain dominance by force of title. Crockett, the embodiment of dignity, showing that truth and resilience need no raised voice to command a room. The duel had narrowed to its breaking point, the silence between words now electric, every ear straining for what would come next. The outcome hung on a knife's edge. And then, with one sentence, Crockett flipped the entire hearing upside down. The chamber had reached its breaking point. The questions, the clipped tone, the weight of authority, it all pressed in like a storm cloud. Justice Barrett leaned forward, ready to deliver yet another jab, but before she could tighten her grip on the exchange, Jasmine Crockett raised her hand ever so slightly. A quiet signal, a pause, and then the silence stretched. It wasn't hesitation, it was strategy. Crockett let the moment breathe, let Barrett's irritation hang in the air unchallenged. The longer she waited, the louder the silence became. Eyes darted across the chamber. Spectators held their breath. Reporters froze their pens mid-stroke, waiting for the words that would either confirm Barrett's dominance or reveal something extraordinary. Finally, Crockett began, her voice low and steady, deliberate as a heartbeat. "Justice Barrett," she said, "you asked me to answer the question as you framed it. But I have to tell you, your framing leaves out the truth. And if we leave out the truth, then what are we doing here?" The words landed softly, but they reverberated like thunder. A murmur ran through the room. Barrett blinked, visibly caught off guard. She was used to witnesses stumbling, attorneys scrambling, colleagues yielding to the gravity of her title. But Crockett had just shifted the ground beneath her feet, refusing to play the game on Barrett's terms. Crockett pressed on, her tone still calm, almost conversational, yet unmistakably firm. "I've spent my entire career representing people who didn't have the luxury of power on their side. People who couldn't afford to craft arguments in ivory towers. People who couldn't count on deference when they spoke. And you know what I learned? That truth doesn't need power to stand. It only needs courage." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Some leaned forward, others exchanged quick glances. Barrett stiffened, adjusting her posture, but the faint tension in her jaw betrayed her unease. Crockett's words weren't fiery, they were surgical. She wasn't raising her voice, but every syllable struck with precision, dismantling Barrett's veneer of untouchable authority piece by piece. She continued, shifting from principle to fact. "You say I should answer the question as asked. Let's do that. You asked whether my position is consistent with precedent. It is. In fact, it is more consistent than several of the rulings you yourself have supported in recent years. When we speak of consistency, we cannot cherry-pick. Either we honor the principle or we admit it's being applied selectively." This time the murmurs grew louder. Reporters scribbled furiously, recognizing the weight of what had just been said. Barrett, the justice who so often cloaked herself in fidelity to precedent, had just been challenged on her own terms, using her own language. Crockett did not stop there. She leaned forward slightly, not aggressively, but with the quiet conviction of someone who had carried this argument in her bones long before this hearing. But this isn't just about precedent. It's about people. Real lives. I come from communities where the court's decisions are not abstractions, they're survival. You can talk about the Constitution as text, but I've seen it as lived experience, and I will not allow this chamber to erase that reality, just because it's inconvenient to the powerful. A stunned silence followed. You could hear the faint rustle of papers, the creak of a wooden bench as someone shifted uncomfortably. Barrett's eyes narrowed, her lips pressing into a thin line, but she didn't interrupt. She couldn't. Crockett had seized the room. Stage by stage, Crockett built her case, not just legal but moral, not just factual but personal. She cited rulings, not in dry legalese, but in plain words that made the stakes undeniable. She pointed to contradictions, not with anger, but with clarity that left no room for dismissal. And then she spoke from the deepest well of conviction, her voice steady but pulsing with emotion. I have been told my whole life to wait my turn, to stay quiet, to let those in power decide when my voice matters. But I am here today because silence is no longer an option. I refuse to let arrogance rewrite justice. I refuse to let dignity be treated as a weakness. And I refuse to sit in this chamber and pretend that power makes you right. The gallery erupted, not in cheers, for decorum forbade it, but in audible gasps, in whispered exclamations, in the unmistakable energy of a room watching history crystallize. Even the justices who had sat impassively through the sparring shifted in their seats, their eyes fixed on Crockett. Barrett, for perhaps the first time in her career on the bench, looked rattled. The tightness in her face betrayed not confidence but exposure. The robe, the title, the carefully cultivated composure, it all seemed thinner now, fragile against the weight of Crockett's words. And then Crockett delivered the line that would be replayed across news broadcasts and social media feeds for weeks to come. Her voice, unwavering, filled the chamber. Power can silence a voice for a moment. But dignity will echo long after power fades. The chamber froze. Not a whisper, not a shuffle, not a breath seemed to break the stillness. Barrett's face was stone, but the silence spoke louder than any gavel. Everyone present understood what had just happened. The scales had tipped. The authority Barrett wielded so easily had been pierced not by volume, not by force, but by truth. The silence lingered until it became undeniable. The moment belonged to Jasmine Crockett. And as the tension eased into realization, as the weight of what had just unfolded sank into every corner of that chamber, the narrative was clear. The justice who had sought to diminish her opponent had instead been diminished. The woman underestimated as too young, too loud, too unpolished had just reminded the highest court in the land that dignity requires no permission to speak. In that moment, the balance of power shifted, and the Supreme Court had never felt smaller. The gavel never came. The session technically moved on, but nothing felt the same. The chamber, once suffocating in tension, now hummed with a strange electricity, half disbelief, half awe. Justices who prided themselves on stone-faced detachment shuffled papers unnecessarily, avoiding eye contact. A few leaned back in their high-backed chairs, staring down at the council table as if replaying what had just happened. Even the clerks, usually silent shadows, exchanged hushed glances. Reporters were frantic. Pens scratched across notepads. Keyboards clattered in furious bursts. Camera lenses zoomed and clicked. Every outlet in the room knew they had just witnessed something that would dominate headlines. This wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was history being carved in real time. Within minutes, the outside world caught fire. Smartphones lit up, live streams clipped the exchange. And before Crockett had even left the marble steps, hashtags were already trending. Pay Crockett clapback, a dignity overpower. Fay Supreme drop. On Twitter, one user wrote, Justice Barrett tried to silence her. Crockett silenced the silence. The post racked up 1 million likes in under an hour. Memes spread like wildfire. One split-screen image showed Barrett frozen mid-glare on the left and Crockett mid-sentence on the right, captioned, When arrogance meets dignity. TikTok flooded with dramatic re-edits of the exchange, some overlaying Crockett's words with swelling music, others looping her final line. Dignity will echo long after power fades, like a mantra. Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts, Facebook shares. The moment was everywhere. Cable news scrambled to keep pace. Commentators who normally spoke in cautious, measured tones couldn't help but lean into the drama. One analyst declared, this was the single most humiliating moment a justice has suffered in public memory. Another countered, no, this was more than humiliation. It was a recalibration. Crockett just reminded America who justice is supposed to serve. Celebrities chimed in too. A chart-topping singer tweeted, Jasmine Crockett just gave us all permission to speak with dignity. Icon. An Oscar-winning actor posted an Instagram story of Crockett's clip with the caption, Power shifts when courage speaks. Activists seized the moment, calling it proof that bold voices from marginalized communities could not only enter elite spaces but redefine them. Meanwhile, Barrett's allies scrambled. Conservative pundits accused Crockett of grandstanding and disrespecting the court. But their soundbites felt hollow against the avalanche of public reaction. The narrative had already been set. Barrett had overreached, and in doing so, had given Crockett the stage to rise higher than anyone expected. On the ground, Crockett's supporters poured into the streets, holding up homemade signs with her words. College campuses organized impromptu watch parties to replay the exchange. Grassroots organizations saw surges of donations with messages attached for Jasmine. For dignity, Crockett herself remained measured, refusing to boast. When cornered by reporters as she left the steps, she simply said, "I spoke what I've always believed, that truth doesn't need permission to be heard." That calm humility only fueled the movement. And yet, beneath the viral memes and media frenzy, something deeper began to stir. In communities across the country, immigrant neighborhoods, working-class towns, black churches, women's groups, people weren't just watching Crockett. They were seeing themselves reflected in her defiance, her poise, her insistence on dignity. For them, this wasn't political theater. It was validation. Barrett, meanwhile, became an uncomfortable symbol. Once touted as the embodiment of conservative restraint, she now embodied overreach, authority turned brittle, a robe that no longer shielded arrogance. Even her colleagues, some of whom agreed with her ideologically, seemed wary of the spectacle. Whispers leaked that the exchange had shaken the court in ways few could remember. By evening, primetime shows cut into regular programming. Hosts played the clip over and over, each time dissecting Crockett's composure, Barrett's falter, and the collective gasp that followed. Editorials went live with headlines like, "When Dignity Outweighs Power," "Crockett Redefines the Courtroom," and "The Day the Silence Broke." For one day, one moment, the entire nation's gaze had fixed on a single exchange inside a marble-walled chamber. And though some tried to frame it as partisan, the truth was larger. It wasn't just about left versus right. It was about arrogance collapsing under dignity, about a system that for once bent under the weight of truth instead of crushing it. But the true lesson of that day went far beyond politics. As the dust settled, Jasmine Crockett's words did not remain trapped within the walls of the Supreme Court. They echoed outward, reverberating across a country wary of division, cynicism, and arrogance disguised as authority. What she had delivered in that chamber was more than a rebuttal, it was a reminder. She reframed the entire confrontation into a universal truth. Dignity will always outweigh arrogance, truth will always outlast intimidation. In that moment, Crockett was no longer speaking only for herself. She became a vessel for something larger, something timeless. She reminded Americans of the simple but profound idea that justice is not about who can shout the loudest, but about who can stand the tallest. Every democracy is tested by the balance of power. Judges, lawmakers, presidents, each carries weight, but none should be greater than the dignity of the people they serve. Crockett's defiance carried that principle into sharp relief. She showed that power, even in its most exalted robes, can stumble when it forgets its purpose. She showed that truth, even when spoken softly, can thunder louder than authority. For countless viewers watching online, her words struck like a lightning bolt of recognition. They thought of the times they had been dismissed in boardrooms, silenced in classrooms, talked over at dinner tables, or ignored at polling stations. They saw in Crockett's calm defiance the possibility that their voices too carried weight, that dignity was not reserved for the powerful, but born in every ordinary life. Crockett tied her stance back to American values without ever saying the words directly. She embodied them. Democracy, after all, is not safeguarded by robes or titles, but by people willing to insist that truth matters. Justice is not preserved by those who wield power recklessly, but by those who remind the nation that every citizen, no matter their origin or background, holds worth. The confrontation became more than political theater. It became symbolic. Crockett's stand illustrated that while power can bully, it cannot define truth. While arrogance can dominate a room, it cannot command respect. And while intimidation can silence for a moment, it cannot silence forever. Her example offered a rallying cry that reached beyond the day's headlines. Courage is not about volume, but conviction. Dignity is not weakness, it is strength refined by patience, by restraint, by the ability to remain unbroken when others demand submission. For those who felt invisible, Crockett's voice became their own. For those who felt powerless, she showed that even in the highest chambers of authority, truth could pierce through. And for those who doubted whether the system still allowed room for justice, her moment proved that when dignity enters the fight, arrogance does not stand a chance. This wasn't just a clash in the court. One commentator reflected, it was a message for every voice ever silenced. Crockett herself distilled it best later when pressed for a reaction. She smiled faintly and said, "Power comes and goes, dignity endures." It was less a boast than a principle, less about her than about everyone listening. That message, quiet, steadfast, universal, became the moral of the day. Arrogance collapses, dignity stands. And in a time when so many wondered if truth still had a place in the public square, Crockett's answer was resounding. Because in that chamber, before the highest court in the land, she proved that while power can intimidate, dignity always wins. Justice Barrett attacked Jasmine Crockett, But it was Crockett who left the court and the nation in awe. The moment wasn't just about a clash of words, or even about two women on opposite sides of a debate. It was about the timeless collision between arrogance and dignity, and the lesson that arrogance always collapses when it tries to tower above truth. Crockett's composure turned an attempted takedown into a national revelation. She showed us that dignity doesn't just survive intimidation, it transforms it. In one exchange, she reminded America that titles can grant authority, but only character can command respect. And in doing so, she delivered not just a defense of herself, but a gift to every person who's ever been told to stay silent, to shrink, or to bow. That's why this story resonates far beyond marble columns and court transcripts. It is about us. It is about the America we believe in, the one where truth speaks louder than power, and dignity endures long after arrogance fades. If you believe in that vision, you're not alone. Join this community where we amplify courage, where we celebrate dignity, and where truth always finds its voice. Subscribe now, join the movement where truth always speaks louder than power. Share this story if this moment inspired you. Send it to someone who needs courage today. And add your voice. What does dignity mean to you in today's America? Because this isn't just a moment in history, it's a call to action. And together, we can make sure dignity always wins.